Most people think an empath breaks loudly. They imagine tears, arguments, emotional collapse. But the truth is far more dangerous. When an empath finally stops caring, nothing explodes. Everything goes silent. And that silence changes the entire power dynamic. Because the most emotionally aware people on Earth don't suddenly become cold. They become exhausted. Their nervous system reaches a point where it can no longer carry the emotional weight of everyone around them. And once that threshold is crossed, something psychologically fascinating happens. The attachment dies before the relationship does. Research in neuroscience shows that emotional burnout changes the way the brain processes social connection. Chronic emotional stress overloads the amygdala, disrupts cortisol regulation, and eventually forces the brain into emotional conservation mode. In simple terms, the empath's brain stops investing energy into people who repeatedly drain them. That's why when an empath stops caring, it feels terrifyingly calm. No fighting, no begging, no explanations, just emotional detachment. And most people never see it coming. Because empaths are masters at enduring pain silently. They stay too long, forgive too much, over-explain, over-give, over-love, until one day the emotional switch flips. And when it does, the person who depended on the empath's emotional energy suddenly feels a psychological vacuum they can't understand. Here's the disturbing part. The empath usually detached emotionally weeks, sometimes months, before physically leaving. Psychologists call this emotional withdrawal adaptation. It happens when someone repeatedly experiences disappointment, manipulation, or emotional invalidation. The brain slowly reduces emotional investment as a survival mechanism. The empath isn't trying to punish anyone. Their nervous system is trying to survive. And once survival mode activates, empathy itself changes. This is why emotionally intelligent people can appear cold after years of emotional abuse. It's not cruelty. It's neurological self-protection. The human brain was never designed to absorb endless emotional chaos without consequence. Studies on emotional labor show that constantly managing the emotions of others increases stress hormones, mental fatigue, and even inflammation inside the body. Over time, the empath's body begins to TR, weeding toxic relationships like physical danger, their sleep changes, their immune system weakens, their anxiety spikes, their emotional tolerance collapses. Then comes the final stage, indifference. And indifference is psychologically more powerful than anger. Anger means emotional attachment still exists. Indifference means the emotional cord has been severed. This is why toxic people panic when an empath goes quiet. They mistake kindness for weakness for so long that they never realize the empath was the emotional glue holding everything together. Until the glue disappears. Suddenly, conversations feel empty. The validation disappears. The emotional reassurance is gone. And the person who once ignored the empath's value becomes desperate to get their attention back. But by then, something irreversible has already happened inside the empath's brain. Their perception changes. The emotional fog clears. And for the first time, they stop seeing potential and start seeing patterns. That moment is life-changing. Because empaths don't just feel emotions deeply. Most people think an empath stops caring because they became cold. But neuroscience tells a darker story. Empath did not suddenly lose feelings. Their brains simply became too exhausted to continue surviving in emotional overdrive. And that changes everything. What looks like emotional detachment on the outside is often a nervous system collapse happening silently underneath. For years, the empath absorbs stress that was never theirs to carry. They listen to everyone's pain. They monitor every mood shift. They walk into rooms and instantly feel tension in the air before a single word is spoken. At first, it feels like a gift. But over time, the body treats it like danger. Researchers studying emotional sensitivity discovered that highly empathetic people often experience stronger activation in brain regions connected to emotional processing, especially the anterior insula and mirror neuron systems. In simple terms, empaths don't just understand pain emotionally. Their brain partially experiences it. That means when someone around them is angry, anxious, depressed, manipulative, or emotionally unstable, the empath's nervous system reacts as if the threat is happening directly to them. Now imagine living like that for years. Imagine constantly scanning facial expressions, tone, changes, body language, energy shifts. Imagine carrying the emotional temperature of every relationship on your shoulders every single day. Eventually, the human body begins to break, and the terrifying part is that most empaths never notice it happening. Because emotional burnout doesn't arrive like an explosion. It arrives like erosion. Slow, silent, invisible. The empath starts waking up tired no matter how long they sleep. Their body feels heavy. Their patience shortens. Anxiety increases. They begin overthinking conversations from hours ago. Their brain never fully powers down because the nervous system remains trapped in survival mode. Science calls this hypervigilance, a state where the brain becomes addicted to scanning for emotional danger. Hypervigilance floods the body with cortisol and stress hormones. Over time, elevated cortisol has been linked to weakened immunity, digestive problems, memory impairment, sleep disruption, inflammation, and even accelerated aging. That means emotional exhaustion is not just in your head. It physically changes the body. Some researchers even compare chronic emotional stress to carrying an invisible illness because the body, DY, reacts as if it's under constant attack, and empaths are especially vulnerable. Why? Because they often mistake emotional endurance for love. They stay longer than they should, forgive faster than they should, absorb more pain than they should. Not because they are weak, because they are psychologically wired to maintain emotional harmony. But here's where the brain begins to rebel. The nervous system cannot stay in permanent emotional emergency mode forever. Eventually, the brain starts protecting itself by shutting emotional access down. This is the moment people misunderstand completely. They think the empath stopped caring. The empath's nervous system simply reached maximum capacity. Psychologists refer to this as emotional shutdown adaptation. It happens when prolonged emotional stress overwhelms the brain's ability to regulate feelings safely. To survive, the brain reduces emotional responsiveness. The empath doesn't choose numbness consciously. Their biology chooses survival automatically. And once this process begins, the transformation is chilling. The empath who once replied instantly now ignores messages for hours. The person who once begged for. The communication suddenly becomes quiet. The one who used to cry during arguments now stares in silence. Not because they feel nothing, because they feel too much, and the nervous system can no longer afford the cost. What makes this psychologically fascinating is that emotional detachment often happens long before physical separation. Studies on attachment trauma show that emotionally overwhelmed people slowly disconnect internally after repeated disappointment, invalidation, or emotional manipulation. The heart leaves first. The body follows later. That's why toxic people are usually shocked when the empath finally walks away. They thought the empath would tolerate everything forever because they always had before. But they never realized emotional burnout has a breaking point. And once that point is crossed, the empath changes permanently. Suddenly, they stop arguing, stop explaining, stop defending themselves, because the brain has recognized a brutal truth. No amount of emotional sacrifice can heal people committed to draining you. That realization alone rewires behavior. Neuroscientists discovered that repeated emotional pain changes neural pathways connected to trust and emotional anticipation. The brain learns from emotional injury exactly the way it learns from physical danger. This means every betrayal leaves a neurological imprint. Every manipulation teaches the nervous system to become more cautious. Every emotional wound reshapes future emotional reactions. And eventually, survival instincts overpower emotional attachment. This is why an empath's silence can feel so disturbing. It's not dramatic. It's final. The emotional energy simply disappears. And the people who depended on that emotional energy suddenly feel the absence like withdrawal, because they were unconsciously feeding on the empath's emotional labor the entire time. The reassurance, the understanding, the patience, the forgiveness, the emotional availability, gone. And only then do they realize how much emotional weight the empath was carrying alone. But here's the most shocking part. Once the empath emotionally detaches, their physical health often begins improving. Sleep stabilizes. Anxiety decreases. Mental clarity returns. Why? because the body is no longer preparing for emotional war every day. Researchers have found that chronic relationship stress can increase inflammation markers throughout the body. Long-term inflammation has been associated with heart disease, fatigue, autoimmune issues, depression, and cognitive decline. Think about that. A toxic emotional environment can literally damage physical health, which means the empath's detachment was never weakness. It was self-preservation. The body was fighting to survive. And for many empaths, this becomes the first time in years they experience peace without guilt. No emotional monitoring. No overthinking every text message. No walking on eggshells. No emotional rescuing. Just silence. And silence changes the brain. At first, the calm feels uncomfortable because the nervous system became addicted to chaos. Many emotionally exhausted people mistake peace for boredom because their brain adapted to constant emotional stimulation. But slowly, the nervous system recalibrates. The body learns safety again. The empath starts breathing deeper, sleeping better, thinking clearer. And then comes the final psychological shift. They stop blaming themselves for everything. That moment is powerful beyond words. Because emotionally drained people are often conditioned to believe they are responsible for everyone else's happiness. They become emotional caretakers for people who never learn to regulate themselves. But eventually the empath realizes something life-changing. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And once that truth fully sinks in, the healing begins. Not loud healing, not dramatic healing, quiet healing. The kind where the nervous system finally unclenches after years of tension. The kind where the brain no longer wakes up preparing for emotional conflict. The kind where the empath stops chasing emotionally unavailable people and starts protecting their own peace instead. And that's the moment everything changes. Because when an empath finally stops caring about toxic chaos, it's usually the first time they finally start caring about themselves. Most empaths are not destroyed by hate. They are destroyed by the inability to say no. For years, they believe their kindness is a superpower. They become the emotional support system for everyone around them. The listener, the fixer, the peacemaker. The one people call during emotional breakdowns at 2 a.m. And at first, it feels meaningful, useful, even noble. But beneath that constant giving, something dangerous begins happening inside the brain and nervous system. The empath slowly loses the ability to separate compassion from self-sacrifice. And science shows that this confusion comes with devastating consequences. Researchers studying emotional labor discovered that people who constantly regulate the emotions of others experience significantly higher levels of stress hormones, emotional fatigue, anxiety, and burnout. The brain treats prolonged emotional caretaking as a form of chronic stress exposure. In simple terms, the empath's body begins paying for everyone else's emotional comfort. One exhausting day at a time. That's why so many deeply empathetic people secretly feel tired all the time. Not physically tired, soul-level tired. Because emotional overgiving drains the nervous system in ways most people never see. The empath answers texts while emotionally exhausted, comforts others while silently breaking, smiles while their own anxiety grows louder, and eventually the body starts sending warnings. Sleep problems, brain fog, digestive issues, emotional numbness, panic attacks, constant overthinking. These are not random symptoms. They are the nervous system screaming for boundaries. But many empaths ignore the warning signs because they were conditioned to believe boundaries are selfish, so they keep giving and giving and giving, until the nervous system can no longer survive the imbalance. This is where transformation begins, not through motivation, not through inspiration, through emotional collapse. Psychologists have found that people trapped in one-sided emotional relationships often experience something called compassion fatigue. It's a condition commonly seen in nurses, therapists, caregivers, and emotionally overextended individuals. The brain becomes emotionally depleted after prolonged exposure to other people's distress, and empaths live inside this state for years. The terrifying part is that many of them don't even realize they are emotionally addicted to being needed, because being needed gives them identity. It gives them purpose. It distracts them from themselves. But eventually, the cost becomes unbearable. One day, the empath notices something disturbing. They cannot remember the last time they felt emotionally peaceful. Their entire life because dame emotional management, managing other people's moods, managing conflict, managing tension, managing emotional instability. Meanwhile, their own emotional needs remain abandoned in silence. That realization changes everything. Because once the empath becomes aware of the imbalance, the brain starts resisting it. And this is where boundaries are born. Not from selfishness, from survival. Neuroscience shows that healthy boundaries reduce stress activation inside the brain. When emotionally overwhelmed individuals begin limiting toxic interactions, cortisol levels often decrease while emotional regulation improves. That means boundaries are not emotional walls. They are biological protection systems. But toxic people rarely see boundaries that way. They see boundaries as rejection. Because emotionally draining people benefit from unlimited access to the empath's energy. The moment the empath says no, the entire relationship dynamic shifts. And suddenly, the people who once praised the empath's kindness begin accusing them of changing. You've become cold. You're selfish now. You don't care anymore. But the truth is far more powerful. The empath is finally left, earning emotional discipline. And emotional discipline terrifies manipulative people. Because manipulation only works when guilt controls the nervous system. For years, guilt was the leash. The empath felt guilty resting, guilty choosing themselves, guilty disappointing people, guilty creating distance from toxic behavior. So they tolerated emotional chaos to avoid feeling selfish. But then something psychologically fascinating happens. The empath begins setting boundaries anyway. And at first it feels terrifying. Their body shakes during confrontation. Their heart races saying no. Their nervous system panics when disappointing others. Why? Because the brain associates people-pleasing with safety. Many empaths grew up learning that love was conditional. Approval came from being useful, agreeable, emotionally available, or self-sacrificing. Over time, the nervous system became programmed to avoid rejection at all costs. So boundaries initially feel dangerous, even when they are healthy. But every time the empath reinforces a boundary, the brain slowly rewires itself. This is called neuroplasticity. The brain adapts to repeated behavior. The more the empath protects their peace, the stronger their emotional resilience becomes, and the physical changes can be shocking. Research has linked healthy emotional boundaries to lower anxiety levels, improved sleep quality, reduced stress-related inflammation, and better overall mental health. Think about that. Saying no can literally improve physical health because the body no longer remains trapped in chronic emotional survival mode. This is why healed empaths often appear calmer. Not because life became easier, because they stopped allowing everyone unlimited access to their nervous system. That single shift changes everything. The empath stops over-explaining themselves, stops chasing emotionally unavailable people, stops feeling responsible for fixing adults who refuse to heal. And for the first time in their life, emotional energy starts flowing inward instead of outward. That's when confidence begins returning. Not loud confidence, quiet confidence, the kind rooted in self-respect instead of external validation. And suddenly the empath notices something incredible. Their mind becomes clearer, decision-making improves, anxiety decreases, relationships become more authentic. Why? Because emotional exhaustion was clouding their entire perception of reality. When the nervous system is constantly overwhelmed, the brain struggles to think clearly. Chronic stress weakens emotional regulation and increases mental fatigue. But once boundaries reduce emotional overload, cognitive clarity improves dramatically. In simple terms, peace sharpens the mind. That's why emotionally healthy empaths become highly selective about who they allow close to them. Not because they stopped loving people, because they finally understand access is earned. And this realization transforms relationships forever. The empath no longer confuses intensity with connection, no longer mistakes emotional dependency for love, no longer believes suffering is proof of loyalty. Instead, they begin seeking emotional reciprocity, mutual respect, mutual effort, mutual peace. And the people who once benefited from the empath's self-abandonment often disappear when boundaries appear. That loss can feel painful at first. but psychologically, it reveals something important. Many relationships survive only when one person tolerates imbalance. The moment balance is introduced, the company, connection collapses. And that collapse tells the truth words never could. But what happens next is the real transformation. The empath starts rediscovering themselves, their hobbies, their goals, their opinions, their emotional needs. After years of absorbing everyone else's emotions, they finally ask a question that changes their entire life. What do I actually need? That question sounds simple. But for an emotionally exhausted empath, it can feel revolutionary. Because many of them spent years believing their value came from how much pain they could endure for others. Now they realize something deeper. Real love does not require self-erasure. Real compassion does not demand emotional slavery. And real emotional intelligence includes the courage to protect your own peace. That's the hidden power of boundaries. They do not make the empath less caring. They make their empathy sustainable. Because when an empath finally learns to protect their energy instead of constantly sacrificing it, they stop surviving emotionally and finally begin living. The most painful thing an empath loses is not a relationship. It is themselves. And most of them don't even realize it. Something is happening. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly. A little compromise here. A little emotional sacrifice there, another sleepless night spent worrying about someone else, another apology for things that were never their fault, another day of ignoring their own needs so someone else can feel comfortable. And over time, something devastating occurs. The empath becomes a stranger to their own life. Their identity dissolves into everyone else's emotional demands. Psychologists call this self-abandonment the repeated act of ignoring your own emotional, physical, and psychological needs in order to preserve connection, avoid conflict, or gain approval. And it is one of the most destructive patterns a human being can develop, because the brain interprets repeated self-abandonment as a survival strategy. It becomes automatic. The empath learns to scan the room before checking in with themselves. How is everyone else feeling? What does everyone else need? How do I keep the peace? And somewhere in that endless emotional calculation, their own voice disappears. Neuroscience shows that chronic people-pleasing activates the same stress circuitry inside, welved in threat response. The brain begins associating self-expression with danger and self-silencing with safety. Think about that. For many empaths, telling the truth feels dangerous, but abandoning themselves feels normal. That is how deep the conditioning goes. Many learned this pattern early. Maybe they grew up in unpredictable homes. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe affection had to be earned through compliance. Maybe conflict felt unsafe. So the child adapts. They become easy, helpful, emotionally useful, and the brain rewards that behavior. Approval becomes dopamine. Being needed becomes identity. And by adulthood, the empath is no longer asking, "What do I want?" They are asking, "How do I avoid disappointing everyone?" That question slowly destroys lives, because a person cannot stay emotionally healthy while constantly betraying themselves. The body keeps score. Researchers studying trauma have repeatedly shown that suppressed emotions do not disappear, they relocate into the body, into chronic tension, into migraines, into digestive disorders, into insomnia, into autoimmune symptoms, into panic attacks. The body starts speaking the pain in the mouth, never said aloud, and many empaths mistake these symptoms for weakness. But they are not weakness. They are biological alarms. The nervous system is begging to be heard, yet the empath keeps ignoring it. Why? Because self-abandonment feels like love. That is the trap. They believe sacrifice proves devotion. They believe endurance proves loyalty. They believe suffering proves goodness. But none of that is true. It only proves conditioning. And eventually, the cost becomes unbearable. The empath wakes up one day and feels empty. Not sad. Empty. They've done everything right. Supported everyone. Loved deeply. Stayed patient. Forgiven endlessly. And yet they feel emotionally bankrupt. That emptiness is not failure. It is a signal. A signal that the self can no longer tolerate being abandoned. This is often the moment healing begins. Not because life gets easier, because denial becomes impossible. The empath finally notices how much they've disappeared. Their favorite foods, they don't know anymore. Their hobbies, forgotten. Their dreams, postponed for years. Their opinions, filtered through fear. It's terrifying to realize you've spent years building a life around everyone else's emotional comfort while neglecting your own existence. But that realization is also sacred, because awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. This is where psychology becomes powerful. Researchers studying identity recovery found that one of the first steps in healing is rebuilding personal agency, the belief that your thoughts, emotions, and decisions matter. For self-abandoning empaths, this feels revolutionary. The first boundary feels unnatural. The first no feels rude. The first act of self-care feels selfish. The first moment of choosing themselves feels wrong. Because the nervous system has been trained to interpret self-prioritization as danger. That's why healing feels uncomfortable at first. Not because it's wrong, because it's new. And yet every small act of self-loyalty begins changing the brain. This is neuroplasticity. The brain rewires through repeated behavior. Every time the empath honors their own need, their brain learns safety. Every time they rest without guilt, their nervous system learns peace. Every time they stop over-explaining, their identity strengthens. And slowly, the old emotional addiction begins to fade. The addiction to being needed. The addiction to rescuing. The addiction to chaos. Because many empaths were never addicted to pain. They were addicted to purpose. And pain had become their purpose. Healing means finding a new one. A purpose not built on emotional sacrifice, but on self-respect. This is when remarkable changes begin. The empath starts noticing silence. Not external silence, internal silence. The endless mental noise starts fading. They stop rehearsing imaginary arguments. Stop obsessing over everyone else's reactions. Stop carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs. And in that silence, they hear themselves again. Sometimes for the first time in years. Their own needs, their own intuition, their own desires, their own voice. That moment can be overwhelming. Many empaths cry here, not because they are weak, because they finally met themselves again. And often they realize something heartbreaking. They were never too much. They were simply giving too much to the wrong places. That realization changes relationships forever. Suddenly, emotionally unavailable people feel less attractive. Drama feels exhausting. Chapter DOS feels obvious. Manipulation becomes easier to detect. Why? Because when you stop abandoning yourself, your standards rise automatically. You no longer beg for breadcrumbs when you remember your own worth. This is not ego. It is psychological restoration. And the body responds. Sleep improves. Digestion improves. Energy returns. Scientists have found that reducing chronic emotional stress lowers inflammation, improves immune response, and stabilizes hormone regulation. In other words, coming back to yourself can heal the body. That's how powerful self-reconnection is. But perhaps the most beautiful change is this. The empath stops performing love. No more overgiving to prove worth. No more suffering to prove loyalty. No more shrinking to preserve connection. They learn a truth that changes everything. Real love never requires self-erasure. If you must disappear to keep someone, you were never safe there. That sentence alone frees people. Because for years, the empath believed losing themselves was the price of belonging. Now they understand that belonging that costs your identity is not belonging. It is captivity. And once they see that, they cannot be it. So they begin rebuilding. One honest boundary at a time, one peaceful morning at a time, one unapologetic decision at a time, and slowly they stop asking for permission to exist. That is what healing really looks like. Not dramatic transformation, quiet rebellion, the radical act of staying loyal to yourself. And when an empath finally stops abandoning themselves, something extraordinary happens. They do not become less compassionate. They become more whole. They still love deeply, but now they include themselves in that love, and that changes everything. Because the moment an empath learns to choose their own peace, they stop being emotionally available to chaos and start becoming emotionally available to life.